Husband bragged he'd take my business in the divorce. He didn't see my trap coming. Divorce is always painful. And even more so when you don't expect it, when the man with whom you shared your life and common achievements suddenly declares you an enemy. John and I have been together for over a decade. We built a business together, overcame difficulties together, and celebrated victories together. Or rather, I thought we were together. But after a while, everything changed. I began to notice that he was no longer interested in the family. However, I decided to turn a blind eye to this, knowing that a new stage in business had begun. Maybe it was just an emotional break. I was grateful that he had always supported me, and that's probably why I had no doubt that everything we had achieved was ours together. John has always been a leader, and I was proud to be a part of his success. Together we overcame stresses when the business started, to slow down and celebrated victories together when we both worked hard to get more. I was not only his partner, I considered myself his friend, someone who would be there for him at any time. But what do you do when the person you love decides to change the rules of the game? What do you do when your support and efforts are no longer appreciated? John was not an ordinary man. He was confident that he could always get what he wanted. And this time was no exception. He decided that he would take everything in the divorce. And not just divide the property as usual, but take what I had been building for years. My business. At first, I couldn't believe it. He sat across from me, his eyes cold, emotionless. I'm going to take your business in this divorce, he said, and I felt these words like a knife to my heart. How could he take away what I had built for so long? I thought he loved me. All these years he had been convincing me that we were a team, that his achievements were my achievements. But now it turned out that it was just a convenient excuse for him to use me to get even more. I sat there in silence. I was stunned. I could not say a word. How could this be possible? We built everything together, and now he just wants to take it all for himself. And not even for any reasons that should be important to him, but just because he decided to. Because in his words, most of this business needs him. It wasn't even a matter of fairness or cooperation. It was his power, his desire to control. And I was just an obstacle. But I couldn't just sit there and let him do it. He didn't know who he was messing with. My strength was not unlimited, but I was definitely not ready to give up, even if he decided that I would just remain helpless. It was not just a denial of justice, it was a challenge. A challenge I could not ignore. His army of lawyers was already ready to come into play, and I realized that I would have to act faster than he did. His plan was to leave me with nothing, and he would just take what was profitable for him. But I already had my plan, and this time I was not going to be inactive. I remembered everything he said about my business and how he devalued my achievements. All these years he could manipulate the situation, convince me that I was just a wife and my business was just a part of his empire. But not anymore. Now he had to see that I was not like the others. In the first days after he announced his intentions, I continued to work as if nothing had happened. At first, I planned how to respond to his actions, and then I realized that all these games were just a prelude. I started collecting documents that he couldn't get hold of. I was not just waiting for a divorce, I was preparing for it. And everything was thought out to the smallest detail. I created my own defense strategy. Every step was calculated. But John continued to believe that it was just an emotional reaction. He thought I was too weak to stand up to him. His lawyers were already preparing all the papers, documents as proof that I could not handle the business. He knew how to take advantage of my lack of experience in some aspects of doing business, and that gave him an advantage. He thought that I was just part of his project and all he had to do was deal with this emotional barrier that I had. But he didn't know that I already had all the documents that he couldn't get his hands on. I collected everything from reports to those who worked with us in the early stages. I knew that we had not just contractual documents, but also relationships that our partners and investors supported, and this was to be my strength. In the first weeks, everything remained the same. He insisted more and more that it was his right to take the business, that I should just give in. I was laughing. He didn't understand what I was doing. I had gathered everything I needed, and now he couldn't stop me. I was ready for a battle, and he didn't know that his plan had many vulnerabilities. I knew that my business would have to go through many challenges, but I was ready. I was ready for no more obstacles to stand in my way, and even if John was planning to take everything, he just didn't realize that I was prepared for it. It was not just a fight for business. It was a fight for dignity. A few days after John finally announced his intentions to take over the business, I realized that the situation would not be as simple as I thought. My confidence did not mean that everything would be immediately resolved in my favor. John was nimble. His calculations were accurate, and he knew how to manipulate people and situations to his advantage. So, now it became a matter not only of protecting my business, but also of preserving everything I had built for so long. I was preparing for anything that could happen, and what he was trying to do was far from a simple division of property. John knew that I was not just his wife, but also a business partner. Therefore, when it came to squeezing everything, he couldn't just take a part of the company. He wanted to deprive me of the right to own my own business, to make sure that he had all the assets and ultimately control. He became so confident that I would not be able to resist that he did not even bother to defend me, thinking that my efforts were just temporary turbulence. I still didn't realize how far he was willing to go, but it became obvious when I saw him start applying mental pressure, trying to show me that it was not his fault, but mine. His favorite phrases, "You can't do it without me. You don't know how it works," began to sound over and over again. It was his tactic to reduce everything to the fact that I simply can't do it. His irony, his arrogance bordering on contempt, all went in unison with his plan. But the more he tried to break my confidence, the more I realized that I couldn't let him outsmart me. I started to notice small details that had been invisible to me before. I found several business deals that John had been signing behind my back. He didn't just want to take the business away. He was manipulating the situation, shifting my efforts to himself, and creating a financial trap that I could fall into. It turned out that some of the deals he made with his partners were specifically designed so that I could not return them. Just imagine, me, a person who had worked so hard to earn a reputation and take the company to the next level, and he meanwhile was signing deals that looked innocent on paper but were manipulated. It was fraud, but fraud so subtle that it was hard to prove until you looked at the case from all sides. I decided to act. If he thought I couldn't see it, then I had to keep working on my strategy. But at this point, I realized that I could no longer trust a word John said. Now I had to be absolutely clear and cold-blooded. And it hit me even harder when he started using my emotional state to try to provoke me into impulsive decisions. From time to time, he tried to make me feel guilty. His words, "You're going to ruin my life," and "You're taking everything away from me," were part of his manipulation. John was an experienced player. His looks, his language, his behavior, everything was aimed at splitting my confidence and making me doubt what I was doing. But what he didn't realize was that I was no longer the same person I had been a few months ago. I was hurt by his words and his behavior, but I was definitely not ready to let him take over. If he thinks he can break me, he's very much mistaken. I knew I had to leave emotions out of this fight, and so, the moment he tried to threaten me with taking more than just the business, I knew I had to act decisively. I could not let him not only control my work, but also my future. I suffered not only emotional but also financial hardships, as he threatened to take away even our joint assets that I had worked hard to build over the years. It was the moment when I finally decided that this was my game. Now I saw John not just as a fraudster, but as a person who wants to break everything into small pieces. And his goal is not just to take away the business. His goal is complete humiliation. But he did not know that I was ready to prepare a response. Not just a defense, but a trap. That night, when John tried to pressure me again, I made my decision. Everything he was doing was just part of his plan, and he didn't even realize that I had been preparing a counter move for a long time. Every step he took, every hint he gave was part of a game in which I was also a player. And if he thought he could win by simply forcing me to back down, he was very wrong. The next day I took action. The first step was to set the entire legal team in motion. I couldn't let him destroy my case, so I hired the best lawyers who had experience in such cases. With them, we started working on closing all the legal loopholes that John was trying to exploit. He could not even imagine what had already been done. Step by step, I prepared my battlefield. But it wasn't just about business. My next strategy was to hit him where he was most afraid, in his pride and control of the situation. John has always been a decision maker. And so his biggest weakness is his own desire to dominate, to control everything around him. I knew this and used it. It was natural for him to put me in a situation where I had to agree to his terms, but now I was ready for his moves. After a few weeks of hard work, I found the moments he had underestimated. John was not careful. He rushed when he had the chance. He was too confident to pay attention to the little things. And that was his weakest point. I collected all his mistakes, all the forged documents, all the false information he passed on to his partners and investors. I used all this as my weapon. But the worst part is that he had no idea how much I already knew. I was waiting for the right moment to come. And it came. John invited me to another negotiation. This time he was more confident than ever. He thought he could solve everything in one go, sign an agreement that would confirm that he would take everything. I knew that was his mistake, that he was already in a trap that I had carefully prepared. In that room, where we were sitting across from each other again, the atmosphere was heavy. I was composed, cool, even somewhat aloof. John could not understand why I did not panic, why I did not try to protect myself. His eyes were filled with anger, and mine were filled with absolute confidence. "You can't defend all this, you know that?" he said, trying to break me with his words. But this time I didn't give in. I held on. Instead of falling into his trap, I simply said, "You are right. You can take what you want, but not everything." He looked surprised. He was sure that I had just broken down and decided to accept his terms. But then I showed him documents that he did not expect to see. I used all his mistakes, the same ones he made when signing the contracts. He did not see how I collected all the information, did not see how I worked strategically to make all his manipulations known. I showed him the fake signatures, the distorted data, and how he himself created compromising situations. John was shocked. He couldn't even believe that I had been so smart and patient to prepare all this. His voice became sharp and nervous as he realized that I now held a stronger trump card. "You can't prove it. Do you know how much money I have?" he shouted, trying to induce fear. But fear did not come. I was ready for it. And then I answered in a way he did not expect. "I don't have to prove anything. You will do it yourself." He sat silently, and I knew that this moment changed everything. I didn't break down. I wasn't going to. But I also realized that it wasn't over. John did not give up so quickly. Although he started to retreat, I was ready for the final battle. And this was only the initial part of my plan. John couldn't accept that his plan was coming apart at the seams. He was a man of actions, not words, so his reaction was aggressive, as he always was when he felt threatened. But this time his aggression was powerless because I was holding facts that could not be refuted. He thought I would just try to pay him off, start complaining about my fate, and give up. But this time I was not as he remembered me. Over the next few days, John made several attempts to bribe my lawyers, trying to convince them to work for him. He even used his acquaintances to intimidate me and tried to get me to give up my intentions by promising that he would win in court. But every attempt he made was unsuccessful. My team was ready. We knew exactly how to move forward. I prepared for everything in advance. Even before the divorce, I started distributing my assets and registering everything with third parties. Now he could demand whatever he wanted, but nothing would happen without my consent. My case was protected from all sides, and even if he tried to attack me in court, I had my answer. Meanwhile, I started to notice that he was getting more and more nervous. John had always been a man with impeccable self-control, but now I could see his composure starting to crack. All of his attempts to manipulate my mood only increased his own anxiety. His gaze became much sharper and his voice more nervous. He could no longer hide his fears. I decided that this was the best time to take the next step, the time to dispel his illusion. During one of our meetings, I told him quietly and coldly, "You think you will solve everything through the court, but in reality you have already lost. You can't win this game, John. You don't see how I have already beaten you." At first he tried to re-engage in the fight with words, but I was adamant. And then he did what I expected. He tried to intimidate me by using his power and connections. He seemed to have forgotten who really controls the situation here. I knew this would be another step towards his defeat. No matter how hard he tried, I already had a trump card in my hand. And then I decided to prepare one last move to finally prove that I had not broken down and would not succumb to his pressure. I opened all my cards and put information on the table that he could neither refute nor ignore. Everything he had done was sealed in documents, and now that this material was going to be presented in court, he would have nowhere to go. John tried not to show his emotions, but I could see his hands shaking. He realized that he was no longer in control. All that was left was to go into the last battle, which I gave him. Almost no chance of winning, but I was not naive. I knew it wasn't over. John could have tried to use his connections and power to influence the court, but I left him no room for manipulation. Every step I took had a clear strategy, every move was calculated, and I was sure that this divorce proceeding would be my victory. All his attempts to confuse me and break me were in vain. The next day, I received a message that his lawyers had begun work on preparing his final offer. John was trying to show his good faith, and this move seemed to be his last resort. But I was no longer the one who needed mercy from him. All my strategies, all my steps were bringing us closer to the final stage, and I was ready to close this chapter. But I also knew that this step would not be the end. When the day of the trial came, I was ready. I had already gone through all the stages, from doubts and fear to absolute confidence that I could win. John was in his element, used to fighting, used to the fact that he always wins, that everything he touches turns to gold. But this time he faced me, and I had no intention of giving in. I was ready not only for the trial, but also for what was to come. When we entered the courtroom, I saw his confidence begin to melt away. John was not ready for what I had prepared. His lawyer was trying to get him ready to fight, but I could see his nerves starting to give out. Looking at me again, he realized that nothing was going to change, and he'd better end the war on his own terms. His attempts to have at least some advantage no longer made sense. And so, at the very moment when John tried to impose another of his peace proposals, I played my last trump card. With a calm expression on my face, I put a package of documents on the table. This was my answer to all his manipulations. My lawyers, like me, were ready for this moment. And this moment became the starting point that finally changed the balance of power. The documents I brought to the court contained all the evidentiary materials related to his abuse, the remaining assets that he had transferred to his shell companies, the fraudulent schemes through which he tried to avoid a fair division of property. His machinations, which he considered unattainable for me, were now becoming visible to everyone. Every document I put on the table became another nail in his coffin. That was the moment when he realized that all he had to do was back down. I saw the first signs of defeat in his eyes. It was not visible on the surface. His voice remained calm and there was no emotional outburst on his face, but I knew he understood. He could no longer convince the court that he was right. I had put him in a no-win situation. For the first time in all this time, he felt his vulnerability, his insecurity. Each subsequent day of the trial was just a formality, and he became less confident, looking more and more confused. I noticed how his manipulations were becoming less convincing, and his attempts to control the situation, scare me and put pressure on my team became even more obvious. I didn't let him get me down. I stood my ground, and with each passing day he felt his influence diminishing. John tried to take the final step to get me emotional, to make me accept his terms and forget everything that had happened. But this last approach had a different meaning for me. He tried to act aggressively again, using his connections and political influence. But I already knew how to answer him. His attempt to buy me through those he considered influential only further revealed his weakness. I was not just a victim to him. I was no longer someone to be intimidated. In the end, it all came down to the final verdict. The tone in the courtroom became more formal, but for me it was a moment of victory. His plan, which he had boasted about at the beginning, had completely failed. He himself had become its victim. Now all that was left was to get what I deserved. And here, at this moment, I felt more than just victory. It was the moment when I felt that he could no longer control my life. His loud words, "I will take your case, I will take everything," now sounded like empty promises. I realized that victory is not only a court decision, it is also my freedom. He thought I would give up because of all this. But this time I was not the woman he remembered. The court decision was only the beginning of my real victory. When I held the final verdict in my hands, everything suddenly fell into place. John didn't just lose. He had lost not only the material assets that he had been so desperate to take away. He had lost control of what he had always considered to be his most powerful weapon, his ability to manipulate people. Although I felt like a winner, I was not naive. I knew that this victory would not give me instant peace of mind. It was just a starting point to build a new life, without him, without his fear and control. The process of selecting assets and dividing property continued for some time, but now it was only a matter of time for me. As soon as it was officially confirmed that he would get nothing, I felt like a huge burden was lifted from me. It was not only a victory in court, it was a victory over myself. I, the woman who had been a faithful shadow of her husband a few years ago, now stood in the center of my reality, and this new world seemed so important and real. But the most important thing I realized at this stage was that even a victory will not make you completely happy. Sometimes what you want most is given to you only to make you realize that the real meaning is not in the material, not in what you can take or leave, but in how you change, how much you can take, and how much control you can keep over your own life. Saying goodbye to John was the last and biggest step I had to take. The moment when I stood in front of him and watched him try to look like he was in the beginning, self-confident, ruthless and strong. But now I saw him differently. He was broken. His airy fortress was crumbling, and although he tried to remain indifferent, I could see his eyes radiating fear and disappointment. His empire was nothing but sand, and he could feel it. If his words used to scare me, they no longer mattered. I looked at him and knew that he was no longer a threat to me. Now I had the right to my new life, to new opportunities. I didn't need his approval or his plans for my life. I was free. But what happened to him? He tried to hold on, tried to find new ways to manipulate the situation again, but it was useless. He could not restore his position. This period was long and exhausting, but the final moment when I left it all was the best. Now I lived without constant fear, without the need to become someone's shadow friend, or a weak part of someone's sinful game again. It was a restoration of myself, a return to who I really was. But for him it was really hard. After the divorce, I found out that he could not recover for a long time. He tried to restore his position, but all his attempts were in vain. Every step he took was backed by doubts, because he was no longer as confident as before. All his manipulations and attempts at control made no sense in the new world I had built for myself. And I moved on. I was free. I had the opportunity to build my life without being burdened by his burden. And do you know what? I have never regretted going through this. Because now, I was real. And when I looked at my life after all these trials, I knew that I was leaving behind more than just the past. I was leaving behind someone who tried to take my future. And now, with everything I had gained, I was ready for a new beginning. There was no bright finish line, no simple happy ending. But it was a real recovery. And that was my real victory.